BCAF's Stanford Carpenter shines a spotlight on author Ken Quattro and his new book, Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books. We join the program already in progress.
By the way, I want to thank you for your introduction. You summed up in 2 pages what I was trying to get across in 250 pages, and that you did a spectacular job. I mean, you did in your first sentence alone, summed up basically the whole theme of the entire book. And I want to thank you for that, Stanford. That was amazing. That was really great.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I mean, to me, engaging the book and writing the intro was a real pleasure. In part because when I first started doing my research, I was an anthropologist in training. I had done all the done all my coursework, and then I was sent out into the field. And what I did was I relocated to Baltimore, Maryland, because I had a fellowship at the Smithsonian, and they were helping to bankroll some of this. And then I was doing interviews up in New York, so I was kind of between. And the first issue that came up was that I was doing an inquiry into something for which there really was not an established history. And so I had come across a lot of the stuff that you go into in terms of I remember actually at a Smithsonian function being introduced to Tom Feelings, and then him talking to me about having Ghost illustrated Batman, and that was really cool. But on the other hand, it's the opening of the can of worms, because here I am at the Smithsonian. I'm walking up to the Library of Congress constantly because they're kind of like, they work hand in hand together. And, it was very apparent even then that you had this issue and of Black creators who were doing comics, but we didn't know who they were. And we also knew that there are Black creators who were creating comic strips in the Black press, and they were also oftentimes the same people. So we knew it was an issue, but the issue was, how do you access it? And then me being an anthropologist, the imperatives of anthropology are not historically based, right? So for me, I was actually there more to answer the question of questions having to do with not just representation, but the construction of representation. So it was, how is it, like even by then, plenty of people had said that the images of Black folk were problematic.
Exactly.
Everybody knew they were problematic. I could go up and there are plenty of comic creators who had already started talking to at length, and they'd be like, yes, this is really problematic. And I'd be like, and then you have to ask yourself, why is this stuff being repeated?
Right.
So that was what that was at the core of my question, but even as I did it, I lamented that the book that you made didn't exist.
Well, and that was kind of like the impetus behind the entire book, of the writing of the book. I don't know if you know too much about the origins of it, but I have to back up about 20 years here. But I was trying to find information on Matt Baker. I was actually writing an article about a certain comic publisher, St. John Publications.
Okay.
And he was their top artist. He was, the top romance comic artist of all time, But when I first started my research, there was nothing about Matt Baker anybody knew, other than the fact that he died young and he was Black. And everybody I asked, nobody knew anything about him. And so finally, somebody along the line, and I can't remember who it was right offhand, said, have you contacted Mr. Samuel Joyner, who had worked for the Philadelphia Tribune, and he was this retired Black artist who knows a lot about, he'd known a lot of Black cartoonists and stuff, during his life. And so I wrote a letter to him. And Mr. Joyner wrote me back this beautiful 4-page letter that I have to this day. I look at it all the time in that, where he not only talked about meeting Matt Baker, but he met Elmer Stoner and E. Sims Campbell and Ted Shearer and Jay Jackson and all these people he'd met. And I was stunned. And so we communicated one or two more times in that, but it was like the spark. You know, to me, I said to myself, I say, like, wait a minute, why haven't I ever heard of these guys? Because I've been involved in comics for literally 60 years. I started back in the early 60s, and I've been doing this seriously, doing this research for since about 1970. But I'm thinking to myself, why hadn't I heard about these guys? Or why hasn't there been anything written about them? You know, there's so much you hear about Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko or whoever. And so I tried doing the normal research I would do, you know, through newspapers and stuff like that. And again, there was still nothing about these men. So it dawned on me, I say, like, maybe I'm looking at this from the wrong perspective. And that's when I started accessing archives of Black newspapers. In Stanford, for me, it was like walking into a world, an entirely different world, almost a different universe. And, you know, as one thing would tie to another, you know, I would learn about these men, like Stoner is a good example. You know, Elmer Stoner was this respected fine artist, classically trained fine artist of the Harlem Renaissance. Yet in comic books, nobody knew who he was, other than, you know, he drew a few things that they knew about.
Right.
But nobody knew who this man was. So anyways, like one thread led to another, and to another, and to another. I kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper into this. And, you know, it's hard to explain, you know, how it is for me as a white man reading this. I was embarrassed, okay? I was ashamed. I didn't know this stuff. I didn't know, you know, the Black perspective, you know, and I still, you know, I don't claim to be an expert by any means, you know, but it was like somebody opening a door, or somebody, you know, lifting the scales from your eyes. It's just like, oh my God, how could I not know this? And I literally read thousands and thousands of Black newspapers. And I started researching, you know, different Black writers like W.E.B. Du Bois. I read, you know, the Soul of Black Folks,
Right.
you know, from 1903. I'm sure, you know, you're familiar with all that. And when he spoke about double consciousness, you know, in there, that was it. It hit me like almost like a train. It's like, that's it. You know, Black people have to live this double consciousness, these two lives, the lives, you know, that they have within their own community, and the world that they have to suffer in the white world. And I have to, you know, just put it like that. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. And that's what I try to convey with the book, you know, is here I am, I'm a visitor to this. You know, comic books were an entry into the lives of these men, but there was so much more to them than just their having worked in comic books.
And one thing that's kind of interesting, especially when you bring up double consciousness, because I mean, I refer to double consciousness
Right,
in the
exactly.
in the intro, and I actually end up picking it up in quite a few of my other writings in my dissertation, way back in the olden days. Is that there's the element that you described, but there's this other element, and this is where where we start to see the importance of your book as well. Is that when we talk about double consciousness, you know, or when W. Du Bois talks about double consciousness, he also talks about a specific kind of power, which is what happens when you see yourself through the eyes of someone else.
Exactly.
When your identity is beholden to someone else's expectations and representations. And I think that's one of the other things that's really interesting about what happens when a book like this is created, right? A book like this, what it does is it is disruptive to a historical narrative, in that it cleaves open, you know, that, you know, if you look closely, you see that little space where like something's missing, and it just cleaves it open, right?
Right.
but it also opens the door to something else. As you start to reckon how it's what happens when you have to reconcile the fact that these heroes, these villains, these protagonists, that there are Black people involved in creating them, whether
Yes.
they are positive or negative. But it's not just that they're creating images of Black folks, but there are Black folks creating images of white folks.
Right.
And so what the absence of knowledge of this deprives us, what it does is it kind of is that it does something that in my research I found is very interesting about the ways identities are formed, and particularly white identity in the American context, which is that it's very insulated, right?
Exactly.
So we look at Black identity as something that all other groups have the ability to kind of have their say in, and then we act as if white identity is not functioning on the same dynamic.
Right.
You know, and what that does is it conveys a sense of relative power and autonomy to certain identities in relationship to others. And that's one of the things I loved about your book, is how it just kind of, it tears that open. And then it's not about making a grand political statement, but it's about readjusting the wages of history.
I'm glad that you put it that way, because I have like a journalistic background, okay? And I try to approach everything objectively, no matter my own personal biases or anything like that. And that's what I try to do with the book, to just present the facts to people, to present, the history to people, not try to give it a twist or create a narrative, but to say, this is the way it was, and I didn't excuse anything that anybody ever did. I didn't try to apologize for anything anybody ever did. But I think that to me, I hope it was an effective means of getting across to people. Like I said, I've gotten a lot of feedback on this book so far, a lot of texts and emails, and the ones that mean the most to me are people say, like, I never realized any of this stuff existed until I read your book, and that to me is the greatest compliment that, they could give me, because like you say, it opens up a line of discussion that we've never had before, at least not in my, realm of knowledge. I don't, but it's just like I say, I hope it's something that starts the conversation, starts the study, and starts opening minds.
And so, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
go right ahead. I'm done.
Oh no, and I think that's actually, something that what's interesting is, what I find also be interesting is how you go about doing that, right? I mean, so you talk about doing the research, going into these newspaper archives and trying to get the information, right? What could you tell us a little more about what that was like, what it was like to go into, and what type of worlds did it open up for you personally?
Well, like I said before, it was like stepping into a different universe. Unfortunately, most libraries, I don't know if any library, kept these Black newspapers.
Right.
It's and at one time they're almost impossible to find. Fortunately, over time, due to the internet and stuff like that, there's been more have gone online, and I made connections with different people, and I found different ways of accessing this material. But it was like I said, it was almost like a humiliating experience in a way, as a white man, to not know this stuff. I mean, Black newspapers would address all the lynchings that were going on at the time. And what was there was like 1,500 in that period from, from the Great Migration up to about 1950 alone. Whereas white newspapers wouldn't even mention them. Articles about police brutality, which were never covered in the white media, or if they were, it was from the other side, and it was just, like I say, it was such an eye-opening experience, Stanford, to realize this kind of stuff. And I personally think that something like, the black newspapers and the black media at that time is something that should be taught in schools from grade school on as chapters in history classes and stuff like that. Just read it. You don't have to, sit there and have it interpreted through somebody, some historian going and telling you what to believe. Read it for yourself, what was going on. And that's the thing about newspapers. Like they say, it's the old Washington Post thing about journalism is the first draft of history. And that's what I got out of that, because you see history happening through the words and the eyes of the people who are experiencing it right at that time. And that's what I love about primary sources like that. And, I think more people should be exposed to that kind of stuff.
Well, what do you think of, this may seem a little bit far afield, but what do you think of, how does that also make you think about where we are now in terms of the decline of the newspaper and the decline of the Black press in particular, and its relationship to, because I've often found it very interesting that it's with the decline of the Black press, like the moment when you actually start to see African Americans being publicly acknowledged within comic books is a moment when the Black press is in decline. And it's actually in a moment where, and also when you look, well, we'll go back to it, but let's start there. Like I'm kind of curious about some of your
that's
thoughts.
That's funny you brought that up, because I discussed that with somebody else not that long ago. That as Blacks, even in just society, became more and more assimilated, I guess, into white society, the Black press diminished. Because the Black press of the 1930s and 40s and even the early 50s was a very vital, rich area. You had every great Black writer, so many of the great Black artists in that, worked in the Black press. But as time went on and they began working in the mainstream white media, it diluted the effectiveness of the Black press. And that really struck me, as it was almost like a counterproductive kind of thing, because what it did, it took away the Black voice in the sense of, like, it was they were, if you're trying to access a larger group, your voice isn't going to be as succinct and heard as directly as if you're talking, amongst your peers. At least that's what I believed in that. And what's happened to media today, to me, is sad in a lot of, because I trained back in the 1970s. I went to University of Michigan, with these journalism professors who had been war correspondents in World War II and everything, and, objectivity and everything like that was very important to our type of writing. And I just think that journalism now is in a sad state, because it no longer has the definition that it did at one time. There's a blurred line now between journalism and editorializing, for instance. And I think that confuses a lot of people, especially with the development of the internet and social media. I just think everything has become so, there's so many voices speaking at one time. It's hard to understand who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't.
Well, yeah, we've lost the editorial function.
Right, exactly.
And that is, after I did my research in my initial research in comics, I spent about 9 months embedded at the Baltimore Sun, most of the time at the editorial board. And one of the things that really struck me, and this is in the mid-aughts, right?
Mhm.
Is journalism had a lot of stuff was happening as we were looking at the decline of the newspaper. Was that I always felt like a lot of the people who were in news organizations were more in love with the paper than the news, right? They're more in love with the fact that it was in the newspaper, and that's what made them vulnerable to what ended up happening on in the internet. But it also made them lose sight of, like, one of the real values of the paper is the editor. It's that
Right.
they say is it what they gather the stories, they're curating the stories, they're helping you to prioritize the stories, and that's where and yes, that's where a certain type of bias slips in.
Mhm.
But I think you're right, and that's and it's also in that moment that newspaper, being a journalist, if you go back to like your professors, right?
Mhm.
They worked at a time when being in journalism was a blue collar job,
Exactly.
you know, where you got your first job in the writing obits, and if you were lucky, you got promoted to sports and the crime beat, and then
Right.
you worked your way up. So you were trained internally, and what we shifted to is um, by the time you hit 1999 2000, you have to have a degree from a major journalism school,
Mhm.
right? Just to
Right.
walk in the door. So all of this is happening at the same time. And I think it's really interesting the way you describe that, right? So coming at this as as a journalist, like what are some of the things that you thought about then, that you, in terms of your study, that you think are not being thought about now, in terms of of the approach to dealing with kind of ferreting out the histories of comics?
Well, okay. Personally, I think that it's what we've always done in comics history, as comics historians have done, is, unfortunately, as people often are fans before they're comics historians, and that unfortunately distorts their their presentation of the history. If you're a big fan of Jack Kirby, and all you want to do is talk about Jack Kirby, it's going to distort everything else around it. It's going to distort your views of Stan Lee or Joe Simon or whoever else he worked with. I started a long time ago trying to take a step back in looking at not just what was appearing on the comic book page, but I wanted to know about the people who were creating this stuff. It's like I said, I have a journalistic, but I also have a fine arts background. That was my major. And in art history, when you'd study a Renaissance painter, you would study about the Medicis, you'd study about Florence, Italy, you'd study about everything surrounding it. You wouldn't just study a painting or just a particular artist. And with my writing, what I try to do is incorporate the world. I try to show where comic books come into their places in the world that they were existed in. In particular, with these Black artists here, there's no way you could look at their artwork and ignore what was going on in their world around them. And like I said, all to me, what the comic book aspect was of this book was an entry into their lives. This was just my doorway into their lives, but these lives were huge, rich fields of accomplishment and talent and everything. And to just look at a few Blue Beetle pages and try to define Elmer Stoner through that is a crime. And that's again, what I try to do is just show that there's so much more to comics and comic history than what is on the page.
And I'm really interested in in how we talk about how knowledge is created in these circumstances, right?
Mhm.
You come at it as a journalist. I come at it as an anthropologist, but there are other comic scholars out there who are coming at it from English,
Right.
from a lot of other disciplines. You know, you know, I you know, it, one of the difficulties in what you're doing is that you have a lot of well, it can be difficult or it cannot be difficult. This is being on the cusp, right? Like you are
Mhm.
writing on the cusp of the ends of these people's lives, right?
Right.
So like if I was to, so if you're to do something on contemporary comics, you have a whole bunch of living people to talk to.
Exactly.
If you were to do something about like the golden age, it's people who are not around. But at, as I was reading your book, I got the sense that you may have had the opportunities to speak to some of the comic creators and some of their loved ones, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what it meant to be in that realm where you had that differential access.
Well, ironically, for the people in this book, I wasn't able to speak with any of them. I wish I had, again, because this was a process, Stanford. It wasn't like it was all like, okay, 20 years ago, I knew this was the list of people I was going to write
Right.
about. I was learning about them slowly, bit by bit. By that time, Tom Feelings had already passed away. The only one who was still alive was Cal Massey, who passed away in this past year. And unfortunately, I never got an opportunity to speak with him. But I did know, Samuel Joyner a little bit, and he was sort of like, my contact point. Ironically, just about a half hour before we started talking here, I got an email from the Library of Congress, from the head librarian at the Library of Congress, and they want to know if I want to be put in contact with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, whose father was Ezra Jackson. And I would love that, because I tried contacting her during the writing of the book, and I wasn't able to get through her office in that, but I would love to do that, because it supplies a perspective that you can't get from a newspaper article or book or something like that. But whenever possible, I did try to get contemporaneous interviews and articles with each one of these men. I've had the opportunity to speak with a lot of golden age artists, white artists. I've met, Eisner, Kirby, Lee, all these guys like that at different times. But again, their perspectives are entirely different than the perspectives of these men in this book here. I just wish I'd had more opportunities.
Well, yeah, and I think that is one of the things that is interesting is that people don't understand how both difficult and how easy it is to reach people, right? Mm-hmm. Like as you were talking about you didn't have a list. Right. I completely feel you on that. I remember when I first started talking mm-hmm. To at the time some of the younger Black comic creators, who are now older, right. And I remember talking to Jamal Igle, and we're trying to figure out, like, he was like, oh, let me see if I can help you out. And I'm like, well, who are the Black comic creators right now who are working? And this is like 2000, and we were like struggling to put together this list.
Right.
Right. And I remember and some of the funny thing is there were people who we knew who were comic creators, right? But we didn't know they were Black because at that time, Facebook wasn't around. So it's
exactly.
like you couldn't see these people. And like we live in a day and age right now where we take for granted that you can see what someone looks like, right? Where we have access, like Facebook is not just social media. It is a giant public archive.
Exactly.
And this is I'll say this is the most embarrassing thing. You know who we didn't realize was a Black artist?
Who?
Sean Martinborough.
Okay.
I mean, he's and like in the Black community, he's one of the most celebrated Black artists, right?
Yeah.
But it's just it's that we hadn't met him. right?
Right.
And I remember uncovering stories about Black people on creative teams where they would know the other members of their creative team for like a year, and it wouldn't be until like they met at a comic convention that they realized that they were Black, right? That kind of stuff. And so when you talk about trying to do this, right? You know, I it's a monumental task, and my hat's off to you, you know, of being able to look back then. But I think what's also interesting is the dynamics of the studios, which I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, because this was a very segregated society. So I'd like to hear you talk a little more about, well, how did they enter?
See, that's a perfect segue right there. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so important to this story right here. The comic shops were basically studios that were set up by independent. A lot of times they're mostly artists themselves, like Eisner and Iger, Jack Binder. There were so many guys that they set up their own comic shop. And what they would do is they would go out and they would approach an editor, or they would approach a publisher, and they would package a comic for them. Comic books didn't all have this bullpen, which, you know, we've come to associate like with Marvel and stuff like that, where you have, you know, a bunch of freewheeling artists, you know, sitting around laughing and joking and stuff like that. It was more like a sweatshop kind of operation, where they would have just a big empty room with a bunch of drawing boards, and literally artists sitting right next to each other, creating the artwork. And in another room, a lot of times you would have a writer cranking this stuff out. And the whole idea was production. It was more speed and just creating as much material as you could. Well, for Black artists, what the advantage was is that comic shops provided a buffer between them and the white editors and publishers. And several artists spoke to that in different interviews I read. Elmer Stoner talked about it. Samuel Joyner talked about it. Hollingsworth talked about it, how they had this buffer between, you know, the white, Hollingsworth referred to Mr. Charlie, how difficult it was to deal with Mr. Charlie, you know, as a white editor. You know, it just struck me, you know, like that these comic shops were like I said, they were a buffer, you know, between the artist physically having to walk into his portfolio and trying to sell himself to an editor who may have these prejudices or whatever. But through the comic shops, and a lot of times with the comic shops, they didn't necessarily work in a studio. They were able to work out of their own homes. Like Stoner had a very well-developed studio. And he also acted as a conduit for a lot of Black artists entering into comic books. And I found a reference to that somewhere. And it was something I suspected. And I finally found a reference in one of the newspaper articles. I believe it was Mel Tapley wrote about it later on, how Stoner provided an entrance, you know, for a lot of these Black artists. He would get them jobs through these shops. And it's you could almost see it in some of the works that he worked on. He was the main artist basically for Fox Comics from about 1944 to 46. He drew the cover of every single Fox comic book during that time period, even though he's never been credited. But every single cover of a Fox comic book from 1944 to 46 is by Elmer Stoner. Okay, he drew the Blue Beetle. He was basically the art director, as far as I could tell, of Fox Comics at that time for Victor Fox. And so you see people like Alvin Hollingsworth doing some of his first work on Bronze Man through the Blue Beetle. You see when Stoner was doing work for Dell Comics, he did a lot of work for their War Heroes comic book series. The only signed comic book story by Owen Middleton was in a comic book that contained, it was almost entirely done by Elmer Stoner. And like I say, you know, it was the advent of the comic shops that even allowed them to have this opportunity. And, you know, it was was just a fortuitous convolution of events that led to Blacks even having this opportunity to work in comic books, because it was the deterioration of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, because it was defunded in 1939, 1940 by the Republicans in Congress. And so it went away. And the WPA had been the employer of all these minority artists. And so they found themselves with no work. And comic books were one of the few areas that a lot of these fine artists and out of work commercial artists could find work. And Stoner was the man who set them up with these comic shops to get these jobs, to have these opportunities.
What I find also really interesting about the comic shops is there's this tendency, and this is something that I try to very much keep in mind, is that there's this tendency for us to think of identity yesterday in the terms of identity today. And so one of the things that happened very early on for me in my research was I started noticing patterns in terms of the way different comic creators spoke, and one pattern that struck out to me was that the comic creators who were phenotypically white, who were most likely to really engage with working on Black characters, and this is like basically in the late 60s, early 70s, were the same creators who, when I interviewed them, would when I asked them the question, how would you identify yourself? They gave themselves an ethnic identity. You know, I'm Irish American. I'm you know, and of course that kind of leads you to also look back historically that before the Civil Rights Movement, there wasn't the same developed notion of whiteness that we have right now. You know, where there was a lot more ethnic and religious affiliation. You know, and as I try to sum it up, you know, back around the golden age of comics, they had signs that said Jews, dogs, and Irishmen need not apply, right? And many of the people who were working in comics who we would think of today as white were actually in one of the ethnic outgroups, right?
Exactly.
They were Eastern European, they were Jewish. There were tensions between Eastern and Western European Jews that were also bubbling under the surfaces, having to do with the waves of migration. You know, that this whole tapestry of identity is much more rich and dynamic. And so when I think of the comic shops, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, is that I also see like a very intentional management of identity, because it's not just that they have a white person facing front and Black and white people in the back. It's like they have somebody who's facing front, and they've got the Irishmen who are told not to apply. They've got Jews who are told not to apply, right? As well. And so did you encounter very much? Did you encounter a lot around how these what I would argue multi-ethnic contexts were managed?
Well, it's again, it's funny you mentioned that. Okay, let me just talk for 1 second about my own personal history. Half my family is Italian, okay, and they directly came off the boat in the early 1900s, and they couldn't speak English. My grandfather, unfortunately, didn't end up in New York City. He ended up working in a coal mine in West Virginia. Oof. Well, you can imagine that they weren't the most welcoming people down there to an immigrant Italian family coming over. My father could remember growing up in the 1920s in the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses across the street from my father's house because they didn't like Catholics, they didn't like Italians. You know, so it wasn't the same experience, you know, that Blacks had, obviously, but there is this level of the strata, you know, throughout the white society of, you know, different ethnic groups, and Italians were definitely towards the bottom of that strata for a long time, up until probably World War II. You know, because again, my father, when he first met my mom, who was German, he couldn't tell his prospective father-in-law, he was Italian. So it was a thing that carried over into the comic world. The comic world was basically the lowest rung of publishing possible. And it was also the entry point for a lot of these ethnics who never would have had an opportunity if they'd been white Anglo-Saxon Protestant walking into a publisher. And if you look at the comic book artists who worked in the industry during that time, most of them were of these different nationalities. You know, they were Jewish, they were Italian, and it very much there was a separation amongst the groups. I had a chance. I got to know Al Feldstein fairly well some years back, and we spoke about this a little bit. And he talked about working in the Iger studio, and his drawing board was directly next to Matt Baker's. And he said, even though, you know, Matt Baker was friendly and stuff like that, he said there was a definite barrier that people couldn't cross. And he said he never would hang out with the rest of them when they'd go out for a drink, or, you know, they would have a party or something like that. And even though they all respect him, they would stand around literally and watch Matt Baker draw, because he was like the star of the Iger studio at that time. But at the same time, they wouldn't associate with him outside the studio. And, you know, it carried over to the own ethnic groups too. You know, the Italians and Irish were always fighting each other. You know, there used to be gangs. Matter of fact, I'm doing research on the gangs in lower Manhattan during the 1940s right now, because I've come across another artist, and he was part of one of these gangs. And it was very much an ethnic separation there. You had the Italians fighting against the Irish. You know, both of them were fighting against the Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Ricans were fighting against, you know, the black gangs and stuff like that. And this stratification carried over into the world of comics, you know, in its own microcosm. It was a smaller world, obviously. But for as egalitarian as the comic book world was, it still had its own prejudices, you know, within it, you know, and it's, like I said, the comic shops were a boom, but at the same time, they were also a microcosm of the society as a whole, you know, with that stratification like that.
And I think that's where, because that's what this is where I was hoping to move the conversation towards, is that's also where the black press becomes very interesting, right? That for one thing that was a little bit different for African Americans was that they had these dual outlets, right?
Yes.
If you wanted to be, you know, because I was asked this question very early on, was like, how come there weren't more black people involved? I'm like, well, if you wanted to be a comic creator and you were Irish or Jewish, you know, which we both agree, right?
Right.
That was your outlet.
Right.
If you wanted to be a comic creator, and also at this time, to be a comic creator, comic books were like, that was the lowest rung. Comic strips at this time were incredibly respected. They were because they were a part of the newspaper, right? And they had their ties to editorial cartoons. And so what I think is interesting is that the Jews, the Irishmen, the Italian, that was their one outlet, whereas the African Americans were kind of bifurcated. Like, they could produce comics for the black press, and they could produce comic strips in the black press, which was of much greater status.
Right.
But I find what's interesting that comes through in the book is that of course they would work in both, because there was more money in comic books. There was like money. There's regular paycheck with no status whatsoever. Right.
And that's it. I mean, it was a way of paying the bills. I mean, you know, especially even a lot of the white Golden Age artists I spoke with said the same thing. You know, we always have this idealized romanticized version of being a comic book artist. They all think of, oh, I was, a comic book, I was Jack Kirby or whatever, back in the 1940s. Most of these guys were, like you say, it was almost like a blue collar kind of, job. It was something they had to do just to put food on the table. And, particularly with the Black artists, if you were a fine artist, say like Elmer Stoner, it's great being a painter, but for every painting that you would create that might take you a week or two or a month, how many comic book pages could you crank out? It's $3, $4, $5 a page, and live in a nice. He lived in a nice apartment, in Greenwich Village, beautiful apartment. Had a grand piano and everything like that. And what was paying for that was the Blue Beetle. Ironically enough, it was this dichotomy that they had to deal with. It was just a funny sort of thing.
Well, but it also is a really interesting labor history, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's interesting when you start thinking of it that way. We often, and I think that this is where some of the fan aspects of what draws people to write and study comics kind of doesn't, makes it a little harder to access, because you tend to think more about the person and less about like, what does this say about labor? Right. And like, what happens when you start following labor? Following labor is still following people, but it's following people in relationship to work. Mm-hmm. And we often forget that yes, when we are, there are a lot of comic book characters that I love, right? I love me a good Legion of Superhero story. But the reality is that and having had an opportunity to speak with Paul Levitz about it, he loves the Legion too, right? Yeah. But oftentimes you forget that no matter how much Paul may love the Legion, and no matter what great work he's doing, ultimately in that moment, it's also a paycheck.
Exactly.
It is a means to an end. And so what that means is that a fan or a critic's view of compromise and the role of compromise is very different. Right. Because for them, the whole end is this story that is, that if you're talking about DC is mythic, if you're talking about Marvel is part of our folklore, right? Right. But for them, ultimately, whether or not a certain character lives or dies is really more about it's thought about more in terms of, well, if I kill this character off, he's selling pretty well.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because years ago, Arvil Jones.
Yes.
Okay.
Very well.
Okay. Well, he's from the same area here in Detroit as me, and we happened to have a table set up next to each other at a comic book convention. I was selling comics, and he was there autographing and stuff. And we just got to talking, and I said, "How do you feel about this fascination with continuity that people have with stories and stuff like this?" Is back early 90s. He goes, "Hey," he said, "we'll just give the people what they want." He says, "I really don't care." It was basically like, it's just like, you give the people what they want, and it's not. Comic fans, I think, sometimes have a tendency to go overboard, and and they forget what it is. It's, especially in the early days, if they created something long lasting or what we consider artistic, it was almost by accident. I mean, for every Will Eisner, you had 100 guys who were just saying like, man, I got to crank out 100 pages, or, not 100 pages, but, a 30 pages here if I'm going to feed my family this month. I got to know Bernard Bailey's family really well. And I've written an entire book that's still waiting to be published about Bailey. And he hated working in comic books. Even though he spent his whole, 50 years working in comic books, he hated it. He was embarrassed that he was doing it. He was always hoping to get a comic strip or something else going on. but it was just a means to an end. It was just a way of putting food on the table. And that's what his son told me. He said, like, you know, my entire family was embarrassed at the fact that my father created comic books. And that's a hard concept to get across to a lot of comic book fans. And with these Black artists, it was probably even more extreme because many of these guys were coming from classically trained backgrounds. I mean, I can't imagine the thought process it would take a guy like an Elmer Stoner to say, like, I got to sit down and draw this crap. You know, it was just you know, it was one of the concessions, you know, the many concessions that Black artists had to make, you know, as well as that's not even getting into the type of characters they had to draw and the stories they had to illustrate. You know, so many of them ended up, almost virtually all of them ended up drawing, you know, these white jungle lords and, you know, jungle goddesses, white jungle goddesses and stuff. You know, what was going through their mind, I thought, as I was writing this, is they had to, you know, concede to doing that sort of thing. I mean, it's like I said, I'm an artist. Like I said, you know, that was my field, and I can't imagine what they had to swallow to do that. You know, it's just to me, it was an astounding, you know, accomplishment. It just says that much more about them. You know.
So let me pick up. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that that's a really interesting point. This whole issue of who you are and what you're called upon to create, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there actually needs to be a lot more discussion about that. Having interviewed a lot of comic creators, you know, and written about, like, comic creators, you know, like Black editors who get assigned to work on creating a Black character, mm-hmm. but they're part of a team of people, and right. What comes out at the very end is, you know, is problematic in part because they're part of a team. You can't have a team right. of people working on something and have somebody never get their way, because then the team right. breaks up.
Right.
But that means that you're going to have some problematic aspects slip in. And, you know, but I also find it really interesting that like, there's also an interesting, like I'm very interested in the okey doke, right? Like, there's a little interesting okey doke. And if you think, on one hand, you can think of it in terms of, you know, this Black creator had to create this white Tarzan figure, right? But there's another side to that story, which is this Black creator used money from making this white Tarzan character to finance a Black strip in the Black press right. that Black kids are more likely to see than the white press that the white Tarzan appears in.
Right, right.
You know, that doesn't make it okay, right. but what it highlights is that there are all these different stories going on, and it brings us back to what we had talked about earlier with what it means when the Black press goes into decline as we have a higher level of integration in society writ large.
Right.
Because my memories of some of that time being one of those, you know, kind of growing up in one of those families that was the first to integrate was that, you know, I don't see how I could have even, you know, to the extent that I had access to something like a Black newspaper, right? Just having access to Ebony or Jet magazine was right. seen as, and where I grew up was seen as being incredibly transgressive to have right. that in that white space. Right. You know, I mean, middle school in Bloomingdale, Illinois, which is like 20 miles outside of Chicago, yeah. I once made the mistake of having Afro pick in my pocket.
Yeah.
And I was actually pulled aside by, you know, the classic one with the little peace sign in it.
Right, exactly.
You know,
yeah.
I was pulled aside. I was chastised by my teacher, and I'm in middle school, right? I barely even understand. Yeah. And I was told that I shouldn't bring that because it's scary and tied to like radical politics. And by the way, I also shouldn't ever say Black is beautiful, right? This is my middle school teacher, you know.
Jeez.
But it's like, but what the reason I bring it up is that when we start talking about like the decline of some of these institutions, is that there are, that integration brings a whole bunch of pressures, right? It changes, now that there are more opportunities for, now that you have opportunities for Black reporters to work for the New York Times, that affects the labor force for the Chicago Defender.
Right, exactly.
And then as the people start to disperse, right? It's, and especially when you have, members of the middle class who have more buying power, they're going into spaces that may be discouraging of them bringing those products with them, right?
Right.
So
right.
it changes all of the market. It changes all the dynamics around it, but it also can lead to something. But it's also leading to something like the introduction of Black Panther, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. See, I always think it's funny personally, that Kirby and Lee get so much credit for the creation of the Black Panther, because I know the intentions are good and stuff like that, behind the creation, but it seems almost I don't want to say condescending, but almost insulting in a way to the Black creators who were more than willing to have created those characters decades before. If you look at Jay Jackson, I think it is a perfect example with the work that he was doing in the Chicago Defender. With he had a character called Speed Jackson,
yes,
which is very much a dynamic comic book character. Even though it was a comic strip, it easily could have fit into any comic book at the time. Even Bunkleton Green, which he did, he had sort of had a science fiction-y sequence where the character became almost like a Superman in it, and it, like I said, this is decades before Kirby and Lee decided to create Wakanda and all stuff like that. But like I just recently posted online the sequence that Jay Jackson did, where Speed Jackson goes to this hidden Black kingdom, evolved Black kingdom of Lastoni. And, it's basically Wakanda only 20 years before Kirby and Lee, and it's just our perceptions in society, how we continue to look at things from one point of view.
Right.
And that's what drives me crazy, Stanford, how people do that, how there's only one perspective, one way of looking at things that we've done here.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Black Panther, because when I, back before there was an Iron Man, back before there was a Marvel Cinematic Universe, and back before they even thinking of it in the mid-aughts, I was doing this research. I'm putting all these different feelers out, and back then it was a lot harder to get a comic creator to return your phone call. And I was at the time I was posted at Johns Hopkins University, and I got a phone call, and it was on my landline. I very rarely ever answered it, and it was Stanley.
Wow.
And and I'd been trying to reach him, and he's like, "Can I speak to Stanford Carpenter?" And I'm like, "Yes, who is this?" "This is Stan Lee." And I'm like, I just about like died, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about the creation of Black Panther. And it's interesting because the story I got about the creation of Black Panther then, when there's very little excitement around him, was a little different than the story I got, or that everyone got,
right,
once the once the marketing machine started going, right? It doesn't take anything away. I'm not saying it doesn't take anything away from Stan Lee or Jack Kirby. But what was interesting about it was what he described was the creation of just your standard Fantastic Four story, which is they go to some weird place that no one's been before, And they get there, and he said, "Oh, and we wanted to have an O. Henry ending, so we figured we'd do something where they go someplace and they think that the group of people they're visiting are really primitive, and then they discover they're really technologically advanced."
Right.
And then and then the very end, he talks about how they're going back and forth, and Jack was like, "Well, maybe we should have it take place in Africa, right?" Yeah. And thus Wakanda, right? But as I looked at the way he described them, kind of backing into Wakanda being in Africa and then it being Black Panther, I'm like, I remember writing this note, this just as easily could have been the brown puma in South America.
Exactly. Well, you know what the original name was of the Black Panther, but
Cold Tiger.
Cold Tiger. You know, I mean, would they have made a movie called Cold Tiger? I don't think so. I mean, you know, it was such a offhand kind of creation, really. You know, and again, that's part of the comic fan problem, is that we put way too much effort or too much thought into these comic book creations, when many times there wasn't that much thought went into it.
And you're right, there wasn't that much thought that went into the creation. But what is interesting is they did understand, once they did make the character, what they were sitting on. And that's why I said, that's why I think what's interesting is that you can actually tell these stories that seem a little less heroic in terms of the creation without diminishing the heroism of the creators. Exactly. And then ultimately what I find fascinating about comics is that you literally create identity from a blank page. Mm-hmm. And before going into archaeology and anthropology, I had a weekly comic strip retelling African folktales in a newspaper in Portland, and what was driven home to me is the extent to which everything is created on a blank piece of page. Everything is an affirmative act, right? If a character is Black, it's because you dip that you dip the brush in the black ink, and but that ultimately how everything turns out is tied up in all these very complicated relationships, many of them interpersonal, and then at the back end, there's this ascription of politics to it. And sometimes the ascription of politics is dead on, and sometimes it is so far off. Right. And that was something else that I learned the hard way very quickly when I first entered graduate school, which I had a professor, a very well-known anthropologist, look at my comic strips, and she immediately said to me, "Oh, wow, this is really interesting. It's clear that this is a very sort of Pan-African view. You've got a very Pan-Africanist politics going here." And I was like, "No." and she was like, "Well, it's obvious. You've got this generalized African background, and et cetera, et cetera." And I said, "But when I first proposed the strip, it was going to have a fourth panel that was going to be a picture of Africa pointing out to what region it came from, so that you'd know that these stories came from different ethnic groups." I said, "But the publisher, when he got it, was like, well, cut that off, and I want a more generalized African look for our audience, right?" And she was like, and it was really interesting, because I knew that my politics going into that was I wanted to tell stories, because this is around the time of the original Iraq War. Mm-hmm. I wanted to tell stories about places that we were being taught to hate. Mm-hmm. It was that simple, because actually the idea wasn't even just to do African folktales, but was to do them from all over the world. And that just brought home to me that, like, oh, I decide what's in here, then I take it to somebody who edits my decisions, and I have a simple choice. I can fight really hard, and we can take a lot of time, and I may not be able to do what I want to do, or I can figure out how to work with these editorial changes and get it out there. Exactly. Well, that's all part of the whole concession thing again. We're getting back around to that. I find that interesting, though. How the different interpretations of your comic strip like that. So she thought you were Marcus Garvey or something. Yeah, and I was just like, it was actually very interesting because what that did was that was one of those moments where it was like, I'm in anthropology. Anthropology values its relationships with people more than it values its relationship with books. We are about being embedded amongst the people who are connected to the cultural phenomena who we follow. And I damn sure am going to go out there and I'm going to interview comic creators. I'm going to embed myself within them. I already know from my own work that what we see on the page is reflective of a process. And I have seen all of these books talking about, oh, there's this many images of Black people and the lips are this thick and blah, 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 blah. And that's great, but tell me about how it got there.
Right, right.
Don't tell me the sky is blue. Tell me why the sky is blue. And
right.
Even early in my research, I remember I was telling you about this before we started the interview, was being with a group of scholars. There's a large group of scholars. Many of them are very well known today.
Mm-hmm.
And the topic of talking to comic creators came up, because at that time that's what I was engaged in. And
right.
And a lot of comic scholarship comes out of disciplines that don't place a high value on talking to creators. Like, you're coming out of English cultural studies, they're more about reading everything as text.
Right.
And so it was like, wow, we should, talking about, well, maybe, what it'd be really cool if we could talk to more creators. And I was like, well, yeah, we should be talking to creators. That's what I'm doing every day.
Right.
And then one of the other scholars said to me, well, you're like a different case. You have connections in the industry, and they're like, if only there was some way that we could figure out that we could make it so that more comic scholars could talk to creators. That'd be, it'd be interesting. But really, this satisfies our discipline, and ultimately we're loyal to our disciplines. But the question kept coming up of like, well, why don't we talk to more, and blah blah blah. And finally, I stopped and I said, guys, you realize that we are at San Diego Comic-Con. Do you realize? And I pointed.
Right.
I remember pointing to the escalator. I said, if you go down that escalator, that motherfucking escalator right there, you will go down onto a floor that has a whole bunch of comic creators. And you know what's interesting about those comic creators? They're like stuck behind desks. They're like caged. They can't leave their desk. So if you go up to there and you start talking to them, they can't go anywhere. They're a captive audience. Right. And you know what you're going to find out? A couple of them are going to tell you to go pound salt, but most of them are going to talk to you.
Right.
So why don't we stop talking to comic creators up here, and we can walk over and go down the stairs or go down the escalator, and we could just do it.
They're amazed, right?
And it was just like it was funny because someone like, well, yeah, but and then it went back to what they were talking about. But it was just but that's what's really interesting. But there's also, I also know embedded in that are certain fears, right?
Mm.
Oh, what if I write something up and I talk to the actual comic creator about them, and they tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
It's that kind of stuff. It's concern about the reaction, to which my response was always, well, one of the best conversations and most insightful conversations I ever had was with Axel Alonso back when he was at Vertigo. And I told him about some thoughts that I had, and he told me I was full of crap.
Right.
And then we talked about it more, and that became a teachable moment that for me, that got me to rethink how I was doing things. There's something that's very subtle. It was a very small thing that that ended up being really important. And I could say that with a lot of the comic creators that I spoke to. I mean, I could say that about Paul Levitz. I could say that about Brian Azzarello, Jamal Igle, Eric Battle. Like the names just go on and on. is that I think that as scholars, as journalists, that sometimes we forget that it's our job. It's not just our job to like decide what the world is like, right? It really is our job to learn about the world.
Exactly.
And then convey that knowledge.
Well, again, that's what this book was for me. I had to learn all this stuff. This was, like I say, this was a new world. This was me walking into a different universe. And again, I try to convey that to the reader. I say that, I'm not an expert in Black history. I wouldn't even pretend, even say that I was. But this is, what I learned. And I want to, share that with you. I want you to, try to experience it too. And I totally understand what you're saying about talking to, comic creators and that. It was over the years now, I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of them. It just, sometimes it's an eye-opening experience. I'll just put it that way.
Right. Well, but it's also something that can be difficult because you have to filter out your fan sensibilities.
Exactly. Yeah.
And be sensitive to their sensibilities.
Right. Especially when you're talking to somebody of a different generation too. I mean, like I say, I'm in my 60s and that, but when I spoke with guys like Will Eisner and stuff, who were, at the time I spoke to them, were like in their 60s. They were like 30, 40 years older than me.
Right.
And it's, again, you're talking to a different world of experience and, a different frame of reference that they have. And you sit there talking to them about their creations and they're looking at you like you have lobsters coming out of your ears, like, really? I don't know. It's like you say, it's an amazing way of learning, from each one of these guys, and each one is a learning experience.
Well, yes, definitely. And we're kind of wrapping up here.
Sure.
What are there any lasting thoughts that you would like to leave the people who have graciously indulged us to listen to our conversation?
Well, it's just that, I just want people to know that this book was just the beginning. I hope this book, like I said to you earlier, I hope it's a starting point for more exploration of these Black artists, not just in comic books. I mean, it's unfortunately, the Black artist has been treated almost like a separate entity from the white artists, in this country. But as far as comic books are concerned, I hope that, people do follow up on this, and there's so much more to learn. This doesn't contain a third of the information that I have. And like I said, unfortunately, I had to stop at 1950. But there's, I have all this information on E. Harper Johnson and Tom Feelings and Warren Broderick and a new artist that I just discovered, to me, new artist named Bill Curry, who worked for New Amsterdam News, but apparently he also worked in comic books for 5 years. It's totally a new discovery I've just had the past couple of weeks. But that's how it is, Stanford. It's evolving, and I just hope that more people get into this. More people. I hope some of these families, contact me or they come out and they speak about it. I look forward to talking to Sheila Jackson Lee and hopefully, learning more about Ezra Jackson. And I just want this to be, the beginning of the discussion, and not the end. I don't want anybody to think that this is a definitive word on anything. This is just a starting point.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for creating this book and